Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this seminar by Professor Lina MARKAUSKAITE and with her colleague Natalie. Specs, yes, right. So both of them come from the University of Sydney, and I've known Lina for a very long time, and I have great respect for her work. And she's very, she is a kind of like a very, I wouldn't say rare, but she is a learning scientist, but she has a very strong methodological and also philosophical underpinning to her work, and so it's a lot of times sort of drilling down into things that sometimes challenging me to think about those things. So and what she's doing today is to talk about the work that is very exciting for me, talking about knowledge work, but the knowledge work much more to do with practitioners, professionals. And I think the work that she has recently completed is with actually developing a program. She was developing a program for helping teachers to work in interprofessional teams. Now, this is very important and also very challenging and very dear to the work that we have been doing in SITE. And I discovered when I went to visit Lina recently that they've actually developed a whole package for professional development with teachers on interprofessional development, which hasn't unfortunately been tested. So I'm thinking whether we could actually try it out, because when she was doing the work, it was during the COVID period. And in Australia at that time, it was forbidden to go into school. So now we are, very fortunate that Lina on her way to Helsinki for the annual meeting of the International Society of Learning Sciences is now passing through Hong Kong. And so we're taking this very nice opportunity to listen to her work. So let's all welcome Professor Lina. And Natalie, you're also...
As it says, it says with Natalie Spence. So if you think of movie titles, I'm just the cameo appearance. So okay. This is the main.
Right. So welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nancy, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here because to be open never was this university, and I thought it's such a great opportunity to meet the team and to see as well, a little bit share my work, but at the same time hear about your work and see you in the place where you do this work. So today my presentation will focus on one project specifically, which we have been doing for almost 3 years, and now it's already finished, but as well in general talking about my work in the context of other projects. So I will start from that background, broader specifically project, then specifically go into one project which specifically focused on developing teachers' interdisciplinary expertise. Then we will have some time for discussion, and if you will be interested more to explore different artifacts, how they work and try them, I look forward to work with you in the workshop after. So context. In general, over the last 5 years, I have been working on a series of projects specifically around interdisciplinary expertise. The main project specifically focused on developing interdisciplinary expertise within the universities, focusing on researchers, how they specifically develop skillfulness to work in interdisciplinary teams, as well on students, university students. The second project, which I specifically will present today, mainly focus on developing teachers' interdisciplinary expertise. I will elaborate a little bit more. And I also have additional collaborative projects with colleagues from 5 different countries, which is called Academic Hospitality in Interdisciplinary Education. So this is additional project, which is kind of small extension, adding a comparative dimension funded by the Norwegian Research Council. If you will be interested, feel free to ask questions. As in any way, it will be me who will be presented, but of course behind this, there is a whole group of people who have been working with me. Natalie, who is here with me today, was postdoc and is a postdoc on specifically project, larger that project, specifically on the interdisciplinary expertise within the universities. In this specific project, the main postdoc was Teresa Swist, who done quite a lot of work, but I have absolute pleasure to work also with several very talented designers, specifically innovation designers, and one ex-PhD student now already working as a colleague and who did a lot of design work is actually Genevieve. But as I mentioned, there are many, many other people behind the scenes with whom I have been working. So the origins of the project, which I will be presenting, even if it focuses on the teachers' interdisciplinary expertise, it's actually extension of the bigger project which focused on the development of interdisciplinary expertise in the universities. What is funded by Australian Research Council, so it's considered quite large project. It in general had two very specific objectives. First thing is to understand how university researchers and students develop interdisciplinary expertise. The second one, how this can be enhanced. Because much of the literature always says, working in interdisciplinary teams is extremely hard. Most interdisciplinary projects actually are doomed to failure. It's almost like this, you know, and it's constant message. And we thought, okay, what can we do about that as learning scientists? How that expertise could be developed, and then, of course, thinking how it can be enhanced. That study was done in two big multidisciplinary centers at the University of Sydney. Specifically, one focuses on nanosciences, another Charles Perkins Center focuses on health specifically research, and as well in the research and educational settings, meaning that we were really studying research teams as well as interdisciplinary courses. The key foundations, key ideas behind that. My core interest for a long time has been development of epistemic fluency, how people become fluent to work with different kinds of knowledge and really understand and embrace different ways of thinking. Between disciplines, of course, but also between practice and theory, between that everyday insight and really broader ideas and so on. I always was looking at knowledge, how people create knowledge, how they work with knowledge. I always took practice perspective. What does it mean in practice? What do people actually do? Taking that very strong socio-materialistic perspective, looking at tools and so on. And when we were doing those initial studies, it was very clear, yes, we talk about knowledge creation now here, but that knowledge works happen in such much broader environment. Yes, it requires personal resourcefulness, personal knowledge, but then whole group dynamic, that group level, as well as the institutional level. When we talk about interdisciplinary teams, what they do, how they work, so much shaped by policies, structures, and so on, which can't be ignored. So we always took that in what we call ecological approach, studying across different levels, specifically starting from communities, organizations, going to teams, and to the individuals. Among my interests always was what I call actionable knowledge, not just how people become smarter for the sake of being smart, but how they become smarter in order to make difference in the world. And as well as the same time, I always usually talk about actionable knowledge. There is another thing, what I call knowledgeable action, how people actually use knowledge in action to make that action better and improve. So that dynamic was always of interest for me. And how, in this specific project, we thought, okay, why not to embrace design, specifically to enhance that cycle between actionable knowledge and knowledgeable action? Because we research, we get that knowledge, design should be able to help us to translate that knowledge specifically into certain actionable insights, and in this way enhance that actionable knowledge. So in this project, in addition to studying those three ecological levels of interdisciplinary teamwork and expertise, how it develops at different levels, we added design components, thinking, okay, we will feed back all the findings into design week, and then of course our created artifacts will be able to enhance interdisciplinary teamwork. So this was the thinking behind the project. When this approximately 2 years, 3 years ago, what we had already in terms of the results, we knew that when we look at those different levels from individual personal resourcefulness to distributed expertise, teamwork, to systems, there are key aspects which are important for that expertise. More or less, kind of one of those aspects always was related to knowledge, epistemic aspects. One of them usually was related to socio-material aspects. Some of it was related mainly to flexibility, social aspects, and one was always that agentic, dispositional, transformative. Doesn't matter at which level we were looking, all those characteristics being able to, something related to knowledge, something related to the ability to change environment and transform that socio-material action, something to language, to social engagement, interaction, and it always will be that agentic dimension. Doesn't matter at which level we're looking, we were able to find those aspects of what this entails in every single layer. Those results into design our week. We worked with professional designers, Cara, Rigley, and Jen. Through design workshops, how many? We did several.
At least 3, yeah.
3 or so, a whole day design workshops facilitated. We ended up developing toolkits specifically for interdisciplinary teams, helping them to address different interdisciplinary aspects. So this was the broader project. Approximately at that time, the Department of Education, New South Wales Department of Education, our state Department of Education contacted us and said, would you mind applying for another project which translates their expertise projects into New South Wales? I thought, actually, I'm not really, kind of somebody who works at schools, in schools. But in general, if you would like us to what we can do, we actually could translate it into specifically projects which would help to develop interdisciplinary expertise among teachers, in service and pre-service teachers, because it's the audience which we were. On another side, to transform school education without changing teaching and helping teachers to develop that expertise is actually quite challenging and almost impossible. So in this way, we applied for a project, and New South Wales Department of Education funded a project for translating our findings into specifically project which would help develop interdisciplinary expertise in teachers, specifically for teachers. And I usually say yes, in the school we almost used to say yes, and even university educations, kind of we teach that discipline by discipline, but when teachers go into the world and their students go into the world, it's not from A to B, but everything together. So this kind of cartoon is very, very illustrative to this. So the aim of that project really was just simply very translational and specific project, much more specific and concrete project than I usually do. And we decided and proposed that as a part of this, we will develop very specific tools. It will be a framework without knowing what that framework will be, and there will be certain design resources. And we will did it. So it was a translational project, and we used specifically translational approaches. I took translational methodology very seriously, thinking about what it can be and how it should be done. Of course, we know translational work is mainly done in health medicine, but there are some also insights and ideas how it can be done in education. So we unpacked this project for ourselves in 3 stages. One was specifically first really doing scoping study and trying to understand what does it mean teachers interdisciplinary expertise. We said that it would be developing, but actually what it is, kind of, and how it looks like. Then on that basis, to co-create certain framework, conceptual resource specifically, which explains what the teacher's interdisciplinary expertise is, and then specific design reforms. Specifically focused not at teachers, but at teacher educators, because at the end of the day, it's teacher educators who develop that, helps teachers to develop that expertise. So some basic principles. We started right from the beginning, kind of that, yes, we have findings which we need to translate, and this is what I showed, that ecological framework. The approach, how we decided to do that, we right from the beginning committed to core design as the key approach, how we do that. As in our previous project, we decided to work with professional designers and design facilitators specifically to do that work. So they are not educators, we just really ourselves interdisciplinary team, but they know how to do this job and do it well. And then working with specifically teacher educators and expert teachers as additional core designers. We knew that the project should be practical. So right from the beginning, we tried to be very, very, very clear this whom we will be working and how. We almost created, not almost, but during one of the meetings as our reference group, we created this, what is called, at the end we call stakeholder map. Specifically identifying people with whom we will work, who should inform us about and specifically know about our results, and whose voices we want to hear. Being very explicit that yes, we want to hear voices of many more people, but at the end of the day, this project will be very specific, and we will be mainly working with teacher educators and teachers. And then what we call those waves, what I called of design and broader consultation, we indeed did like this. There was a stream of work which was very, very specific and really going deeply into research and applying research, different methods, starting from literature review, research literature review, then doing interviews, consultations with experts, specifically teacher educators, whom we sampled specifically more than 20 interviews, who gave specifically feedback on our this literature review and consultation, already questions which we had. Then all that we fed into core design workshop, again with the experts specifically to help us to design that initial our framework. And then after that, already the next one workshop, design workshop, where we were developing concrete design resources. During that time, we always bounced, kind of communicating that with broader audiences, doing webinars, communicating with our reference group, and so on. So we're going through those things on one side, keeping it very, very specific, on another side, with consulting. Now I will just briefly show you key ideas which came from this process almost through all the stages. So the first stage was what we call scoping review, which involves also consultations with the experts. How we did it? We started from developing what we call consultation paper, really going through literature, available literature, and trying to identify what does literature say, what does it mean, teachers interdisciplinary expertise, how it's usually developed currently, what are the main enablers, what are the main barriers. Very simple consultation paper we wrote, it's available online if you will be interested. And our key finding already, just by looking at the New South Wales, our Australian document, that technically this interdisciplinary expertise, was my phrase, is an elephant in the room. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Because when we were looking at the document, so one of the requirements in the Australian national curriculum, that teachers, there are what is called cross-disciplinary themes, which technically every single teacher has to teach it. It includes sustainability and other topics. So, but it's there. Every subject should teach. Technically, nobody teaches at the end of the day. But this is one of the important things. Then we have as well our, kind of specifically declaration, the central document, which very, 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 very strongly focus on developing those 21st century skills, generic attributes, generic quality, generic skills, which should be taught, but again, it's left for teachers to decide. Then New South Wales, of our specific states Department of Education, has this specifically their national policy, which specifically says that really focuses on applied skills, that all disciplinary skills should be applied and teachers should specifically help students to see connections with real world. So applied knowledge specifically is the key, which again involves crossing different ways of knowing. Then, of course, there are other things like digital technologies, emergence of AI, again, as big stress, specifically that teachers need to embrace them, how that's not clear. Then we have teachers' education standards specifically, which teachers themselves are taught sociology, curriculum studies, psychology, other disciplines, but it's up to them how they learn to integrate and develop that interdisciplinary, at the end of the day, expertise to develop. The new document specifically which released, which is called Strong Beginnings, which now actually mandates every single teacher get basic understanding of the neurosciences and related specifically knowledge and integrate them into their teaching practices. How to do that specifically? Nobody talks. So it's really, when we look at where that interdisciplinary expertise could come in, it comes from very, very different angles. But it's never talked as interdisciplinary expertise. It's talked as a problem. Teachers don't integrate knowledge of psychology and sociology and curriculum studies. Teachers don't do that. Teachers don't do this. But, kind of, which clearly relates to the knowledge integration, those interdisciplinary aspects. Now, how we thought that more or less try to create certain, kind of coherent framework out of those different ideas. We separated between two things, what we call really teachers' interdisciplinary expertise related to teach different subjects which require knowledge integration or aspects which require often knowledge integration, like cross-curriculum teaching, STEM team, and then developing students' capabilities and so on. So teachers' own expertise develop those integrative skills in students. But then around that, there is a whole layer of additional skills and expertise, which are necessary for teachers just to do work, right? Including to use digital technologies, to integrate knowledge from psychology, sociology, curriculum studies, and other disciplines which they teach as a foundational knowledge within the universities, as well to participate in different interdisciplinary professional communities, which usually in the school is the case. We also, call over here one of the dimensions, maybe a little bit unique to Australia, what we call decolonizing interdisciplinarity, because in the Australian context, when we talk about interdisciplinarity and knowledge integration connection, we still talk quite a lot from the global north perspective. There is one way of knowing, there is disciplines and so on. But in the Australian context, of course, now more and more acknowledged that it's not only about thinking, when we talk about knowledge, only about global north knowledge. There is also indigenous knowledge, which comes with their own ways of knowing, their own knowledge systems, and they also need to be integrated. And that notion of interdisciplinary itself needs to be expanded beyond thinking in that wide global north specifically way about what it is it includes. Then we had a whole set of consultations. There is a document specifically which we developed, which we called scoping study, which specifically talked about this experts specifically about those different aspects. What does it mean, teachers' interdisciplinary expertise? What aspect does it include? How it is usually developed? What are the barriers? What are enablers? They are summarized. I will not go. I just simply wanted to show, we ended up with really quite thorough review what we have, what kind of the situation we have currently. And we fed all those insights back into our thinking. Okay, how on earth we can make sense? And this was the really results of my postdoc, Teresa's thinking. She said, technically we could think about aspect by aspect of interdisciplinary expertise, but there is also a whole very useful emerging body of literature on teachers as curriculum makers, specifically saying that when teachers engage in making curriculum, meaning, making sense of the curriculum and adapting their specifically for their action. This is actually, this process itself is multi-layered, systematic, non-linear, and it involves almost every single aspect which we found as a result of the specifically consultation, which was as an aspect of teachers' interdisciplinary expertise. So that notion of teachers as curriculum makers first gave kind of a core around which we could think how to help teachers become better curriculum makers, being able to draw on different kinds of knowledge when they make that curriculum and develop those different teaching resources. And as a part of that literature, it's everywhere says, yes, even in those systems where teachers have a lot of autonomy and are expected to engage in that curriculum making, actually professional development almost missing or not effective. So that curriculum making practices are actually quite hard and need attention. So out of those consultations we developed, so consultation paper was a separate paper, and then we wrote that what is called scoping study involving the consultation paper and our interview questions. So we published one report, but then the next one, our document was developed as our promised framework. When we started to think about that framework, how it could be, we knew that, well, we are doing translational work, so we had our, kind of that model already more or less how that ecology of teachers' interdisciplinary practices should look like. But when we rethought, because when we look from a teachers as curriculum makers perspective, everything, those layers almost, they enmeshed together. It's quite challenging to think in levels. Everything almost together. Then we used slightly look differently rather than trying to unpack level like level. We looked now in each level at different aspects: social discursive aspect, epistemic, material, agentic. Just kind of technically reshuffling it, but putting at the center what teachers do, teachers' activity at the very, very, very center. Here, my colleague Peter's Goodyear work is quite influential. He has ACAT framework developed, so this was the extension of that framework. But the key idea, putting at the center teachers' activity, what they do, and using it as the starting point to think about specifically how we talk about teachers' interdisciplinary expertise. When you were thinking about that framework, the key idea which I was saying, we definitely can't develop a map, very, very clear picture of what it is. We definitely can't develop a guide. It just simply would be too ambitious. But what we can do is to develop almost a compass for teacher educators, which would help them to navigate this territory of teachers' interdisciplinary expertise. So our core thinking about this framework was specifically inspired by the idea of the compass, giving directions how to go, helping to navigate, rather than specifically giving very, very specific guidance. We developed that framework around 4 key things, thinking, okay, what do teacher educators practically might need if they now work together and seriously think about how to develop certain program, professional development program for teachers interdisciplinary expertise. They most likely will need still certain knowledge from research. This is why research is important, kind of what does research say? They need may need or find useful some guidance how to explore that research a little bit further, engage in thinking deeper. They definitely will have a lot of experience themselves. They will have a lot of situated experience. So it would be important to help them to share that experience and help them make sense out of that experience. And of course, then build on it and together develop specifically resources, curriculum for teacher educators, professional development. We created this kind of matrix as a framework, but technically, to be open, even if it's like this, then each that cell is actually underpinned and unpacked in this framework as a set of activities for teacher educators, which they could do while they develop curriculum for teachers. I just to illustrate and make it very specific, kind of specifically will take the first one principle. which a little bit I already touched before, multidisciplinary foundations of teachers. So in order to develop those multidisciplinary foundations, the key principle which came from our research insights, specifically on consultations, that the key is actually still prioritizing epistemically sound, authentic activities for teachers, educators, not diminishing the value of the disciplinary knowledge and understanding interdisciplinarity as well and seriously, but at the same time, not doing everything at the same time. It's all the time. We developed 2 approximately pages resource explaining key ideas from the literature in a very, very compact way, but then giving teachers activities, specifically further to explore. There's 3 very simple questions saying, okay, this is what research says. What do you think about it? Are there other dimensions which could be added, how they are related, and so on? It's just exploration activity, helping them to engage with those ideas deeper. And then 2 activities specifically building on this and inviting them further. Share what you know, share about your situation. What do you think specifically? And then making the next step. Moving already to what we call knowledge building activities, specifically saying, okay, so what's your situation? What kind of solutions might be specifically helpful? Specifically guiding through that more or less thinking process. And every single principle in this guide is unpacked like this. There will be certain resources, this insights from already research, summarized usually in 1-2 pages, but then there will be explore activities and there will be share and build activities, guiding through that process. At the very end of our guide, we actually added some activities, also what we call synthesis level, not just aspect level by level, but also how to bring everything together. And one of those activities saying, okay, if you now had to imagine, kind of how the development of interdisciplinary expertise could look like in your specific context, how it would look like, and guiding them through an activity to create their own model of what that interdisciplinary expertise might look like. This was created by our workshop participants, so just as an example, specifically giving to them a little bit thing. Because from all our consultations, one aspect which also emerged was that unless we really change policy decisions, it's also very, very, very challenging to change and introduce that interdisciplinary expertise. So at the synthesis level, we actually design also activities for decision policymakers, specifically helping them to guide through that decision making, what needs to be changed specifically in order to enable development of the interdisciplinary expertise. So even at that level, but again, using exactly the same structure. Then, so this was the framework. And from my perspective, this guide, which includes framework, because it's so activity related, is actually the main document. Some participants, when we communicated, said, actually, it will be good to still have a little bit more concrete resource with more specific ideas how to really, that teachers, educators can use. So then we fed back the framework, back all insights which we had into another design workshop where we tried to develop what we call ended up being design principles for teacher educators. We long talked whether it should be design principles or patterns. You might help me to decide. We ended up with principles rather than patterns because our designers, professional designers, thought that principles should be slightly different thing. Yes. When we developed those specific different ideas, specifically already concrete ideas, we used very similar approach. It was a co-design workshop working with teacher educators, small group of experienced teacher educators. And teachers, by small group, I mean a little bit less even than 10, I think, at the end, really, those who were doing work. And really, during very intensive whole day workshops, generating sets of ideas useful for practice. around the issues which we identified through our consultations as barriers, specifically for developing teaching educational expertise and summarizing them. We really focused rather than on developing one specific principle or, kind of really zooming very, very, very deep, trying to create and assemble groups of ideas which could be useful and presenting them what we call design principle. But for a long time, we ourselves debated whether it should be design principle or pattern. Each of those design ideas or sets of design ideas is explained always in the same format, just usually on 2 pages. How those things in practice look like? Like one of common topics which that teachers don't have time for interdisciplinarity. And our specific experts were suggesting different ideas how technically that challenge of time could be overcome. So basically, those considerations is the summary of those specifically sets of ideas which technically could be useful to overcome. And then activity idea is one specific idea that teacher educators can do and try specifically when they try to develop certain, already think about interdisciplinary teaching, but specifically lack of time, if they lack of time. And our experts, for example, were saying, well, start from 15 minutes activity if you teach, let's say biology, integrate maths, kind of, and plus then integrates as well writing language, because asked to present the results and write up, explain the results. So those simple activities already can be utilized for developing the interdisciplinary expertise. There are much more. All this resource is available online. You can download it and use. In general, there are 16 of those patterns explained. They all have similar format and principle. In addition to that, in this book, we worked with experts to develop 5 case studies where they use their experience of how they specifically introduce interdisciplinary education in teachers in service and pre-service education, giving their own examples. Those 5 cases also are in this specifically resource available. And as a part of that resource, we also created that activity, how to develop what we called your own framework of teachers' interdisciplinary expertise, which could guide you then through that process and so on. Specifically, and this activity, I think we will try to, I have those shapes because it has, by our designers, they developed quite very specific methodology to look at it. You even physically cut very nice plastic shapes. I didn't bring them because they would be 10 kilos to be open. So I have paper shapes, so we will be able to try. So again, different ideas which help teachers potentially, could help teachers specifically to work with those things. So I was quite quick, very deliberately trying not to go too deep, but giving more time for discussion. What emerged as an outcome of it? First thing, that there is definitely no single way to develop teachers' interdisciplinary expertise because it's such a multifaceted as phenomena itself. So when we think about development and developing the design resources of it, a flexible approach is absolute necessity because otherwise we will be stuck. I was absolutely against creating a guide or resource which lists teachers' interdisciplinary competences one by one because I knew that it will be obsolete in one day, because this is how it is and perhaps not most useful. And what we developed, I think it's a resource which is really inspired by that ecological approach. And this, from my perspective, it offers a useful tool for teacher educators, not even for teachers, but for teacher educators or teachers who take certain roles as mentors, leaders in their schools specifically. A resource, a tool specifically, which helps them to work together and think how that interdisciplinary expertise would be developed for individual teachers, for their groups, for the school and community as a whole. And this is the main message. I don't think that this is a transformation. It's slightly different way of thinking about design work and expertise. And thank you. Now we are ready for questions.
So any questions? Start with one.
Yes.
Earlier you had this framework where you go from the micro to the meso to the macro and then the synthesis. So yeah, yes, clearly it is an ecological challenge. But then when you are actually doing so making the knowledge actionable. So you have this package materials to work with teachers. So when this is in action, would the teachers be from the same school, from different schools? Do you design, how do you design the composition of the people and so on? Can you sort of give us a bit more of a kind of a concrete feeling of how it would?
Okay, so then I will specifically draw on the cases there are 5 cases in this specifically guide. So 2 of those cases are very, very typical cases, specifically teacher education program. Yeah. So where students specifically already, work in a course, in a unit specifically, which in general can include that called interdisciplinary component. So for example, one of those specifically units was specifically for teaching what is called community languages. So all languages taught in Australia, which are not English, which there are, I think, Natalie, how many? 50 something around that number, yeah? So there are courses where there is a teacher who has to teach methods for teaching languages other than English. Mandarin, Spanish, perhaps Lithuanian, my own wouldn't be there, but still, it's around 50 languages. Technically, it's Italian and so on. But all languages, how to teach languages taught in one course. She always, of course, she knows, of course, several of those languages, but still teachers who will teach languages which she never learned. Her idea that AI would be most helpful. So as a part of it, she specifically thought, okay, rather than focusing only on curriculum skills, curriculum development methodology skills, she would integrate digital technologies and specifically AI and give students a whole set of activities, developed activities, specifically how to develop language learning resources using AI, starting from generating text appropriate for the reading level, then how to using AI for recording specifically with as well, listening texts as well, and other different AI tools. So you see, all of her focus is really, kind of on teaching language curriculum, but then integrating it with different languages, but actually scaffolding students themselves to integrate. And plus, in addition to that, bringing AI. So this was very one specific idea. Others, kind of other in that teacher education context case was where key subject was, again, technology skills. But the idea was to use specifically games in that technology skills course, how teachers to help learn gaming different aspects or techniques, pedagogical techniques, and specifically do it by asking students to create that resource using gaming techniques, which would specifically focus on an interdisciplinary topic. They very deliberately directed them saying, hey, this is our Center for Health, which is Charles Perkins Center. Find from one of the papers written by a researcher from the center, scientific paper, but which has important health message, and create a resource which would be appropriate for level 7 or 8 students, specifically explaining this health message in a language which includes those gaming techniques and pedagogical techniques in an appropriate way. Again, on one side, the topic itself already multidisciplinary, kind of teachers need to also, kind of cross that boundary between scientific knowledge and language accessible for students. They need to learn gaming pedagogical techniques and integrate while they creating resource and so on. So this was another. Other two cases we have where expert teachers working in schools, taking leadership positions, gave their examples how they work and organize their colleagues to work in interdisciplinary teams and their interdisciplinary projects. Giving very simple tips in those cases, saying, well, start from key learning objectives, kind of mapping together and so on. So completely different resource. The other one case came specifically from STEM education professional development run by our STEM Academy. So it's, again, completely different case context. So all those cases were very different. This is the nature of that interdisciplinary expertise. It can't be developed in one context. Different people will be developing it in very, very different situations, in very different contexts. Some of them will be doing in pre-service teacher education in individual units. Some of them themselves already will be doing in schools as a part of their informal professional learning in the schools. Some of them will be doing outside, as a part of formal professional development. So when we were creating those resources and activities, we were trying to work in a way that whoever picks up that framework, they should be able to use those guiding questions. And they should be helpful for them to think through their situation and come up with solutions. Yeah. Okay.
Very fascinating. To what extent your research work has impact on the policy, because you want to have interdisciplinary education and equity, because equity through policy changes. Yeah, to what extent Australia or Sydney has changed the policy?
This is actually the question perhaps which for me is the most hard to answer, because technically this project was specifically kind of commissioned by the Department of Education. Even if it was competitive process, they technically asked us to do. It was, COVID didn't help us, so I should admit. From the department, even in the contract, it was very direct commitment to be involved. They technically, we had one on our reference group, kind of, but that's all the kind of the involvement was. Once we finished the project, submitted the report with all the recommendations, including the recommendations for the department and suggesting that we could come and present and so on. That was it. So they were busy, but I should admit no uptake in general or help specifically to make impact from their perspective was minimalistic. Maybe again, I blame it on COVID that it perhaps did not help them, kind of. But even if they asked us to do the work, but it was very, kind of right from the beginning clear that they're struggling to even engage us, kind of. Not like they would come and would say, well, it's not your ideas are not appropriate, applicable, simplify or do something, but just simply not being engaged right from the start.
But I think one of the strengths is that it's not New South Wales curriculum.
Yeah.
And that it's something that can be applied wherever anyone's thinking about interdisciplinary education and teacher education. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to still follow up a bit more on the ecological delay. So say, for example, in the cases that you described, how many people were involved? And yeah.
So each of those cases was led by usually one person who specifically, owns that case. Then it depends on the specific situation, kind of like that specifically gaming. So that unit is actually quite large. It's perhaps will be more than 100 students who undergraduate students who try. Community languages, it will be smaller, 30, 40 students. Specifically STEM Academy's case, I think they had a special project which is, and I would say between 10 and 20 school teams. So each school team was composed from 3 or 4 teachers, which included language teacher and several, kind of STEM subjects teachers plus health teacher, kind of. So it's usually involved, how to say, each case was slightly different depending on the size of the site in which it was specifically being tried and tested.
So the questions that, or the framework, so you get the framework has sorts of these multiple layers. So the framework or the questions is more for people who want to think about it. So they are sort of like thinking frameworks rather than, so if the framework doesn't sort of involve in, say, who needs to be involved or that kind of.
It does have this kind of guidance, but it's not perhaps as, kind of prescriptive as perhaps it's potentially could be. Of course, when it discusses, let's say certain ideas, kind of at the level, of the course designers would say, well, for course design, there are usually interdisciplinary education, there are such models, one module in a larger curriculum, whole course, and so on and so on. Okay. But then together in your context, think what kind of model would be appropriate, kind of, and whether you need to discuss, just in your team or potentially invite head of school, kind of to sit together. We more or less left those decisions already thinking, well, we are developing resource for very, very smart people who are teacher educators, so we don't need actually to spell each, kind of detail, kind of just more, kind of thing. This is what research is saying, kind of, just now there are a couple of things to think through, to help you to get to the point faster, let's say, they perhaps would get to that same point themselves. But we actually very intentionally try to give some guidance, but definitely not to over-guide, because knowing the diversity of the situations, it was very, very clear that.
Okay, yeah. Hi, very impressive work, because I also see the importance of developing interdisciplinary expertise in teachers in order to cultivate problem solver in the real world. We mentioned about the ecology of the interdisciplinary practices, the macro, the meso, and the micro level. I'm particularly interested in the possible approach to centralized curriculum in a culture where rote learning and exam performance are prioritized. Because we cannot transform those things at the macro level overnight. I'm wondering if you have examples or insights of what could be a possible approach in developing interdisciplinary expertise in the East Asian context, including Hong Kong.
Yes, it's a very actually great question. Definitely, there is a difference between those really centralized prescriptive systems, and those which really almost loose systems who build on teachers' agency and independence. In this level synthesis, as I mentioned, we had this one of our, kind of those design in the framework, those patterns were specifically, or activities were specifically what we thought, kind of could be for policymakers, but actually could be for anyone who still works at that level, kind of, and needs to think about policy and those bigger decisions. And from that perspective, we here now just thinking if it's already visible in this resource or not. But in general, in our science, there are also, kind of activities and prompts, even for teachers, to think agentically. Okay, this is for you an obstacle. Think through. This who you need to talk, or whom you potentially need to, or could impact in order to make it happen. It's not unusual, teachers decide, okay, we want to do this project, but the first thing is curriculum time structured, classes structured differently. How can we, kind of just simply find that space where we don't have this subject, but teach together, kind of. it's a big political, well, kind of structural question, kind of if we teach together, kind of if our classes simultaneously, then perhaps, kind of somehow, kind of finding space could be possible. But if, kind of those classes are different and I have to go to somebody else's class and somebody else needs to come to my class, the workload doubles twice. How to find those, time and resources. So none of those decisions is neutral. So there is actually, we very deliberately built in those questions saying, go actually think about those things and think whom you could impact, with whom you need to talk in order to make those decisions at the strategic systems level, kind of not think that, you now design that nice project, interdisciplinary project, which, triples your workload and it will be sustainable. It's not sustainable. And it's important to make sure that, kind of those changes take place at the system level. But in that guide, there are activities which in general, on one side, those who are already at that policy level prompts them to think what they need to do if they're really serious and want to make that interdisciplinary teaching sustainable. On another side, for people who engage bottom up in those interdisciplinary activities, what they should potentially think about and do in order to really, prompt that system change and not just keep going and then getting tired and one day abandoning everything. So this is what we were thinking, kind of.
Yeah, actually, I think here in our center, we've been doing a lot of sort of work with schools, and we also we really dirty our hands working with teachers and trying to get sustainable, transformative innovation. And we have a framework, and our framework is really prescriptive. Prescribing, basically, I mean, you have these levels, and you're talking about the questions. We don't prescribe the questions, we prescribe the structure. So we say, if you want to, say exactly the kind of questions you're talking about. So you need to have timetable issues, who needs to be working together, how can we co-plan or whatever. Then you need to engage the people from the different layers. So they need to work together. And so we're really, and we've been sort of very much adopting, our sort of prescriptive framework is from the need for infrastructure, in which Bill can you talk about. Yeah. So it's quite interesting. So it's a kind of like, so you have questions, we have prescriptions. And it could be a good sort of complement.
It perhaps no. We were thinking, of course, about our perhaps also cultural context. In Australia, it's very difficult to prescribe anything, especially
When we say prescriptive, of course we can't prescribe anything because we have no jurisdiction over any of the schools. But because they come and work with us, they want to change. So this is what we say, this is what you need to establish in your school. And we also explain how we develop our project in such a way that we can learn from each other. And it is very interesting.
So in this one guide, there is that STEM, specifically academy space. So they also tried to make that systemic change, but their approach was doing like this. So rather than doing that professional development for individual teachers, doing it for groups of teachers, but as an essential requirement for being accepted in that professional development program, they had to bring head teacher along. So in every single that professional development session, head teacher has to be involved. Just because they wanted to make sure that this is sustainable, it makes those who are responsible for that are involved, they know what's happening, and they champion it, and enable make that change.
Right.
But that approach was very light from that perspective. The only thing is just that you can't attend this professional development specifically session, which was almost half a year series of sessions, unless you're head of that department commits come along.
And was that having so that you noticed whether those cases they were, those who bring their head teachers along, Were they really successful?
So in general, because I know that program a little bit more, I work with that college. In general, it has had huge impact specifically because most of those participants who were admitted to that project were schools which have very high level of migrant children. So I think all schools had more than 50% of kids specifically from migrant families for whom that learning on one side STEM, but on another side language, kind of was a huge issue and for teachers. So teachers were really motivated to make difference in their schools. So those usually head teachers who came. So those interviews after that, and I think they did again interviews after half a year or year, or I think except one school were showing that they not only sustained those activities which they started, but other teachers started to do very similar things in their schools as well, kind of for teaching, integrating language more systematically into curriculum and so on. So from that perspective, yes, because there was commitment, even if they did that very, very locally.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Actually, I came across this resource book before the talk, and because I think it's quite nicely both provide the information but presented it in a way that's quite visually understandable. And I have a question is regarding, say if we put the framework in the professional development context, in the networked learning, is a group of teachers, say 100 or 200 from the different disciplines. And I'm interested in how you, or have you noticed about at the method level, if we say the teachers all have the co-design of an individual case that developed through a period of time, and we organize all these teachers together, there are design thinking and design questions at each stage emerge as they develop. So how can we develop, or how can we collect or coordinate their challenges and their questions, and so that we can capture their design thinking to better improve in the next cycles or more design?
I think it's a very, it's a very good approach. In that book, we have some ideas specifically, which one of the patterns specifically is around community development. So I think we link it here to show communities of practice. Again, when we talk about communities of practice, there is no one answer what that community could look like. It could be from whole country community, it could be a community within the school. But as a part of this, of course, we're saying, okay, make sure you have regular meetings, make sure you have, certain digital space to share resources, kind of, and so on. Those key principles, which we know are essential for keeping community going and updating, keeping those resources updating and so on. We built in, but as any resource, or that this broad level resource, it really gives just very, very minimal kind of pointers where to go, thinking, okay, if somebody really starts building a big community, they perhaps will go find a book, how to build learning communities, and read thoroughly, kind of follow up, kind of specifically the ideas, how specifically to possibly, kind of to build that knowledge and so on. So we were not really thinking through the mechanic, technique, how actually that knowledge accumulation, knowledge building, specifically in the curriculum area, could be sustained. I think it would be almost a separate project from. It's a very interesting project, but it's almost a separate project from my perspective. And perhaps you, Nancy, have done some work in that area.
Yeah, we've been, so maybe we can also talk later afterwards, because we've been actually doing knowledge in action or actionable knowledge for quite a bit of time. But of course, we were not doing the detailed sorts of, you have very detailed guidelines. We don't have these detailed guidelines. We have broad sorts of principles. In fact, we do have broad principles. So we have the multi-level, multi-scale sort of framework, and with that we also get teachers to share. So we don't give them a lot of things so that they need to be figuring out.
Yeah.
But obviously they also have common issues. So I would say a lot of these I haven't seen all the things, but I think some of the sort of suggestions we can already see the teachers doing. And often what we try to do is to give questions, or we actually talk to schools, and I think the sharing of experience among schools has been very helpful. And we've had, and of course, in terms of sustainability, it's difficult to say, but I think we do have some schools that has been working with us for 7-8 years, and we actually see them, developing very rapidly. And some of the schools, because we have done more work to scaffold them. And also resources to start with. So we have some schools that are newly joining and actually developing very rapidly in the first sorts of couple of years. And also I think at the policy level, they don't tend to say publicly that they like this framework or whatever, but they do actually come back to us year after year to do this kind of project. And it can be a kind of like shifting the focus of the innovation because of the changing times, but they like the framework and so on. So I think that's also something that is quite positive, but I would say I also been thinking, can we make it more, because I think, in this case, so we've been actually we were building the structure now. So with the structure and with the activities, we can help the schools that are engaging. But something like this is standing beyond the actual structure. So I've been also thinking, can we do more like a kind of like a framework and all? A more detailed system. I think in a way more. Can we have a kind of like a technology platform that also has built-in sort of instruments for whoever's involved? At least I think it needs to be at the institutional level and see how things are evolving and giving some sorts of feedback. But that's a huge thing.
I think you're reading my mind when I said, it's a project and so on. I thought, okay, definitely, it would be nice to build a ecological platform, which, kind of, on one side helps, kind of to keep those resources,
Maybe we
but then
can talk
keeps
about
semantically, kind of as well, once you update, kind of keeps those, all the information, but also tracks, kind of changes and so on. Then, of course, nowadays is AI establishing those semantic connections. It's not already, it shouldn't be so difficult, kind of, so. It is indeed, kind of between humans and technologies that the distribution of labor gives new ideas how that knowledge could be built and in a more sustainable way. But it's intuitively, well, it should be quite technological.
Right.
I also wanted to suggest, so from the research that we've been doing on academics, researchers, some of this has been hit and miss, but creating interest networks. So I'm thinking if you're talking about a community of practice between schools, it might be mathematics educators and connecting along their particular discipline, but how others are working in that sort of interdisciplinary sphere. So beyond sort of the everybody all in, I'm also a learning designer at another university, and the thing with academics, and I think would be the same with teachers, is show me in practice what someone who does my job has done. Don't tell me all this theory, show me, tell me the theory and I can understand that, but show me what they've done, how successful it's been, and some steps that I might use to apply them. And so I think, that connection with people who are doing what you want to be doing is so helpful.
Right, so, yeah, so actually we've overrun for quite a bit of time, but it's very good. And so let's all thank Professor.
Thank you so much.